berjuang fisabilillah, tuju satu arah dan tinggi di jurang kalimatullah. Berpegang tawakal gapai cita dan suci mardatillah. Sabar gigih cekal menyebar risalah Rasulullah.
Kerana dakwah tugas mulia, pusaka agung para anbiya, menyelamatkan umat mesti sepenuh daya.
Walau dicaci, jua dihina, tidak akan memadam bara cinta.
Rela dikorbankan segala-galanya demi redha Maha Esa. Yayasan Dakwah Islamiah Malaysia melestari gerakan dakwah, menyatu memandu ummah, menyebar risalah nubuah. Yayasan Dakwah Islamiah Malaysia, medan sinergi dan ukhuwah, binaan rukun bersatu tubuh. Siru ala barakatillah, siru ala barakatillah.
Yadim yang berusia Datuk Ahmad Alam Abdul Rahman, Presiden Wadah, Pencerdasan Umat Malaysia, Profesor, Doktor, Datuk-Datuk, Datin-Datin, Ketua-Ketua dan Wakil Jabatan dan Agensi, Wakil-Wakil NGO dan hadirin majlis sekalian. Selamat datang ke Pagi Konvensyen Madani 2024 untuk hari yang kedua. Yang berbahagia, strengthening demi yang berbahagia, Profesor Yadim Dr.
He's a scholar of Islam, no doubt. His latest contribution is a new Maqasid methodology that aims to bring about a restructuring of Islamic scholarship around a complex network of the higher objectives, meaning Maqasid of the Quran, and also the prophetic traditions. He is the president of Maqasid Institute Global, a think tank registered and building research and educational projects in a number of countries. He is Al-Shatibi, Chair for Maqasid Studies at the International Peace University in South Africa, a founding and board member of the International Union for Muslim Scholars, and executive member of the Fiqh Council of North America, a member of the European Council for Fatwa and Research, and the chairman of the Canadian Fiqh Council. He has a PhD in the philosophy of Islamic law from the University of Wales, UK, and a PhD in systems analysis from the University of Waterloo, Cairo, Egypt. He worked previously as a professor at the University of Waterloo, Ryerson, and Carleton in Canada, Library. Faculty of Islamic Studies, Qatar, American University of of which were translated in 25 languages. So I must say, as a Muslim from Malaysia and also parts of the world, we are proud of you, Prophet Yasir Auda. MashaAllah. It's a great contribution to Islam and also to Dakwah. So without further ado, let's have Prophet Yasir Auda deliver his talk on the Maqasid framework, inshallah, and then we can have an active question and answer after that. Jazakallah khair. So please, Prof.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أسعد خلقه وخاتم رسله محمد صلى الله عليه وآله، ورضي الله عن المهاجر It is such an honor to be here in this gathering, and I would like to thank you very much, Jazakumullah khairan, for those who invited us to participate in this very important discussion. Barakallahu feekum, Hadrat al-Mufti, Barakallahu feek, Jazakallah khairan, Wadah people and everybody here with their titles due. Barakallahu feekum, Jazakumullah khairan, wa nas'al Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala at-tawfiq wal-hidayah. Okay, open this. Oh, okay. Yeah, we can keep this, inshallah. Yeah, I'll hold it. Barakallah. No worries, no problem. Just have to read a few things from here. Very slight. Barakallah feek. Excellent. Excellent. This is good. Alhamdulillah. Thank you. Jazakallah khair. What we are talking about today is one of the chapters of fiqh. We have a deen that is not just confined to the ibadat. Islam as a deen is not only for ta'abudiyat, is not just a ritualistic religion. When you say the word religion in English, it means a pact of men who define a particular system of rituals and a particular articles of faith. Islam is not a religion in that sense, because the word deen in Islam includes everything in life, includes politics and includes economics and includes the society. It is part of Islam not to deal in riba, for example. When you talk riba, you're talking economics, and therefore the economic system is part of Islam. The political system is part of Islam. the social system, the design of a city or a building, not just a mosque, the design of the city itself is part of Islam. And the use of water and the environment and trees and animals, what to eat and what not to eat, and what to wear and what not to wear, all of the things that have anything to do with life is part of Islam. What we're talking about today when we talk about Madani is actually a chapter of fiqh that is called fiqh al-siyasa al-shar'iyya, the fiqh of siyasa. We call it siyasa shar'iyya because it has to be based on the sharia. And I will speak about the role of Maqasid sharia and so on. And the idea of the siyasa al-madaniyya or the dawla al-madaniyya, a book of mine that I asked my brothers to put here in the slide, a book I wrote about 10 years ago, published in Beirut, that addressed some issues related to Ad-Dawla al-Arabiyya, the Arabic country at that time, because during that time of the Arab Spring, we were debating a lot. What exactly is the state? Are we going towards secular states or Islamic states? And some people, they mean by secular state has nothing to do with Islam. And some people, they mean by Islamic state, appointing a high council, you know, as our brothers in Egypt, for example, proposed, appointing some high council that controls the state, or as they do in Iran in the model of the high council. So what is it? What is the state, الدولة in Islam? And fiqh al-siyasa, if you go back to its sources, when we teach about fiqh al-siyasa al-shar'iyya in kulliyat al-sharia, we teach from Ibn Taymiyyah, al-Ra'i wal-Ra'iyya, we teach al-Mawardi, fiqh al-siyasa al-shar'iyya, we teach from al-Juwayni, Ghiyath al-Umam. We have a number of textbooks in fiqh al-siyasa. The problem with these books is that they talk about a different state, a different system from any system we know today, which is the nation state, the system that developed originally in Europe, in Westphalia, and eventually borrowed, and eventually it became the system of the world. We live now in nation states. So I cannot really go and copy from Al-Mawardi when he talked about Ahlul Hal wal-Aqd, the people of decision, and say that the parliament is Ahlul Hal wal-Aqd. No, because the parliament is done in any country based on a particular system that is defined by the constitution and is not defined by the system of scholars that Al-Mawardi is talking about. I cannot go and copy from Ibn Taymiyyah an idea because he's talking about a different state. Or Al-Juwayni. Where do I go? I go to contemporary scholars, scholars of Islam who talk about the siyasa shar'iyya today. And we have a number of those at that time. And in this book, it's actually quite a substantive book, about 350 pages. I made a summary of the different approaches to Ad-Dawla al-Madaniyya, which is the title of that book. Primary of which was the approach of our Ustad, rahimahullah, Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi. He wrote a book called Min Fiqh al-Dawla fil Islam. Ad-Dawla fil Islam. What is a state in Islam? What is the fiqh of that state? And in that book, the Sheikh was proposing an idea that many built on it afterwards, that we are not calling for Dawla Almaniya, we are not calling for a secular state. We cannot accept a secular state. And we are not calling for a Dawla Islamiyya. We are not calling for an Islamic state in the sense of having the head of state as scholars. But we are calling for Dawla Madaniyya بمرجعية إسلامية. We are calling for a civil state with Islamic reference. And then the Sheikh went on in his book, and I actually added more details, and I gave my staff a copy of the book and discussed some of the ideas at that time. He went ahead with a lot of details. What does it mean for the Madani state, the Dawla Madaniyya, to have Islamic reference? What is Islamic reference? And the Sheikh talked about is talking about the marji'iyya of al-Sharia, that the Sharia is the reference of the state. What does it mean for the Sharia to be a reference of the state? وثيقة الأزهر. Look it up on the internet. وثيقة الأزهر. Factors. It is just anything that is a sin in the Sharia, haram in the Sharia, automatically becomes a crime in the law. This is not how Islam is. Islam does not say that every sin becomes a crime in the law, and therefore the state has to find who is eating pork and who is, looking, staring in an Islamic way, and who is swearing, and then they are arrested and put in prison. This is not the Islamic structure. The Islamic structure defines a particular number of principles that guide the state. السياسة القيام على مصالح الناس. If you go back to, again, al-Mawardi and Ibn Taymiyyah and all of that, Ibn Khaldun, when they talked about the siyasa, they said siyasa is about achieving the maslaha, achieving the interest of the people. And the way to do that, and the criteria and the method to approach that, is actually by looking at the set of Maqasid al-Sharia, the higher objectives, the higher principles. What do we take from the higher principles so that we translate them into masalih al-nas? And once you talk Maqasid al-Sharia, you are talking priorities, because you have to prioritize your battles, your issues. At that time, for example, I mentioned this in this book, and I have another book called Bayna al-Shari'ati wa Siyasa, between Sharia and politics. I have a chapter there on the application of hudud. At that time, in the Arab Spring, there was a big debate. What is the Islamic state, or the Dawla Madaniya Marja'iyya Islamiyya? Some people said, and state becomes Islamic when it applies the hudud. Now, you have to, for fiqh siyasa shar'iyya, to develop and look at this question in a more comprehensive way. You have to, first of all, differentiate between the kinds of hudud that are mentioned in the Quran that is considered hiraba. Now, the current fiqh considers rape to be part of the hiraba, and so is to punish thieves. And the Quran is talking about al-qadhf, or slandering people, that is part. As-zina, that the zina itself, that is a had, is a zina that is witnessed by 4 people. Because if it is witnessed by less than 4 people, it is zina, it is a kabira, but it's not a had. Because if you go and you don't have 3 witnesses with you and accuse someone of zina, it is slander. Now, there is a ridda, or apostasy. At that time, the debate was that the ridda has a had, and actually ridda does not have a had. The Prophet ﷺ never killed someone because they left Islam. إن الذين آمنوا ثم كفروا ثم آمنوا ثم كفروا ثم ازدادوا كفرا لم يكن الله ليغفر لهم ولا يهديهم سبيلا. The Quran is talking about people who become Muslim and out and in and out, and that by itself is not punishable unless the person commits treason. من بدل دينه فاقتلوه. If the person leaves your army and fights with the enemy army, treason, yeah, that is the ridda, that is punishable by the had. And now, when you look at the hudud, you have to look at the higher principles, the maqasid of the hudud. The maqasid of the hudud are al-adl, the justice. If you want to apply the had of sariqa, or the theft punishment, you have to apply it to everybody. You cannot apply it to the weak and poor only. Otherwise, this is not an application of the hudud. And if there is a shubha or a doubt for justice that the hudud will apply to some people and not other people, then you do not apply the hudud. This is the Sharia. Umar radiallahu anhu did not apply the hudud during the time of famine. And the Sahaba, all of them, during the times of war, they did not apply the hudud. Why? Because during the time of war, there is a doubt in justice there. It is an exceptional time. And therefore, the application of the hudud is not necessarily part of a law in a modern state or a Madani state. Why? Because you have, first of all, priorities before the hudud that should take place, and then you could think about applying the hudud. What are these priorities? The priorities are to inform people about the crimes. You cannot punish people if they don't know that a crime is a crime. This is Sharia. And the preparation has to do with justice. You cannot apply the hudud of theft on people who are hungry or people who do not have the basic needs. And when they steal, you punish them. But when the big people at that time in the Arab world, we were saying, when the ministers and princes and all of that steal from the public funds, we don't apply the hudud on them. So why do we apply the hudud on a poor servant or a driver who steals a wallet? This is not the right application of the Marja'iyya Islamiah. This is not what the Marja'iyya Islamiah in the Dawla Madaniya means. What does it mean to have the right priorities for your policies? And the right priorities have to deal with the bigger crimes before the smaller crimes. And it has to deal with the major issues before the smaller issues. One of the major issues in Islam is corruption. You have to deal with corruption before you talk about the application of the hudud, even theoretically, let alone practically in an international system that does not allow you to do that. And this is a consideration from the Sharia perspective. But even before you think about the hudud applying, you have to look at, are people needy? Are people hungry? Do people have the basic needs? And if they do not have the basic needs, then the priority of the government.
Seperti yang kita tahu, jenazah sangat penting digunakan untuk
a Marja'iyya Islamiyah is to make sure that people have the basic needs. What are the basic needs in the Sharia? For people to be able to eat and drink, for people to have clothes and housing. People have to have dignified housing in the Sharia. People have to be able to get married in the Sharia. Men and women, young men and women have to be married before you you apply any hudud on them in terms of zina. And why? Because you are creating a problem as a state by not fulfilling the priorities of Islam. And you want to punish people for crimes that there is doubt in just when there is a doubt, do not apply the had. And therefore, we should shift the debate about the Islamic reference from the hudud and the centralization of this topic. And it is not a priority. And we should not make the hudud a priority in talking about the Islamic reference. And we should make the application of the Maqasid of the Sharia a priority. Hifz al-Din, we have to make sure that people know about Islam, the 5 pillars. Societies. Hifz al-Nafs, we have to make sure that people's lives are protected. There are so many pandemics and so many diseases of the time now that are killing, not just murder. Murder is a big problem, and we have to deal with it very seriously because that is hifz al-nafs. But hifz al-nafs includes hifz al-sihha. It is part of Islamic governance to make sure that people's health are protected. And people's health is protected by the health system. You have to take care of it. You have to make sure that the drug industry is not really harming people, but rather serving people's interest. You want to make sure that they are not dealing and trading in people's life and death, but rather you are protecting people's health. When you say hifz al-ird, or the protection of honor, we have to educate our youth first about right and wrong. And we have to open the doors for marriage for them. And we have, as a government, to facilitate marriage and to use some of the public money for the sake of our younger brothers and sisters to get married before you want to apply the punishments of them if they commit a crime because they are not. And hifzul mal, before talking about preservation of wealth for the rich, as it is usually actually interpreted, it's not right. We have to talk about the preservation of wealth for the poor. Islam deals with poverty in a very serious way. And the anti-poverty program, I mean, to speak modern terms in English, has to be a priority in the government because poverty is a problem from the Islamic point of view. And to have an Islamic government is not to cut someone's hand when he is poor and needy and they go out and steal, but to cut the hands of the more powerful when they steal. That is the application of the Sharia. And if you cannot apply that, then at least you want to make sure that in the society, there is no need for people to transgress the lines and start to steal, whether to steal from the public money or the private money, whether to steal in any form of corruption. Therefore, you are really talking about anti-corruption. At that time, in the Arab world, we were talking about anti-corruption as a priority before we get into the debate over hudud, whether we cut people's hands or cut people's necks. But we have to cut people's necks if their stealing from the public money is going to harm people and is going to cause death, as we saw at that time in Egypt, since I was involved a bit in the debates of the time. A minister of Awqaf, after the Egyptian revolution in 2014, told me that the total of the amount stolen from the Egyptian Awqaf was something in the figure of $13 billion from the Egyptian Awqaf, from the lands and the madrasas and all of that. And therefore, at that time, the priority was who stole those $13 billion from Egypt that's supposed to be poor and people cannot find food on the street. How come people steal from the Awqaf, from Wazarat al-Awqaf al-Islamiyah? People are stealing billions of dollars. I heard that myself. And of course, at that time, they had investigations, committees that are trying to investigate. This kind of investigation and anti-corruption, not just in the Ministry of Islamic Affairs, but every ministry, is a priority for an Islamic government. And that is the real Madani with an Islamic reference that you talk about. And that is real Islamic governance. Islamic governance, my brothers and sisters, is not about what you wear or what you say. It's not about the flags you fly and the slogans. It is about what you do as a government. And yes, what you do as a government could be similar to other governments that talk about anti-corruption who are non-Muslim. Some people in Europe are also complaining about corruption, and they form anti-corruption. In Canada, for example, we have a big concern about what we call conflict of interest. And for every transaction that has to do with the government, you have to clear your conflict of interest. You want to make sure that you are not doing any nepotism, you are not benefiting a wife or a son or a cousin or an aunt or an uncle, etc. And the government becomes very harsh. That is also Islamic. And as Muslims, we contribute to anti-corruption in Canada as much as we contribute to anti-corruption in Malaysia or in Egypt. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in His Sharia, He made laws not just for Muslims. The Sharia is not just for Muslims. Sharia is for everyone. And the principles of the Sharia, the anti-poverty, anti-corruption, you want to make sure that kids are married. This is not just for Muslims. We want to make sure that kids are married in Europe too, and in China too, and everywhere in Africa. Why? Because this is the fitrah. Allah created us, subhanahu wa ta'ala, in a fitrah, and He sent the Sharia for all humanity. It is true that some elements of the Sharia are specific for Muslims. We Muslims, we pray 5 times a day. We have our salah, we have our masajid, we have our hajj and umrah. We have certain things that are specific to Muslims. And non-Muslims too. Christians have their churches, and other religions have their temples. This is part of the system too, part of the siyasa shar'iyya as well. It is not haram to have a church on land of Muslims because secular or doesn't have an Islamic reference. And the idea of Madani is actually the latest idea in the Islamic thought that has to do with siyasa shar'iyya. This is the latest ijtihad of the mashayikh and the ulama and the scholars who wrote about siyasa shar'iyya in our time. In this book, I can send for those who are interested. I have a summary also in English. You'll find many references for many scholars who try to explore what is a Dawla Madaniyya from an Islamic perspective, and how can our ijtihad for today make sure that we have the principles of Islam in that Dawla Madaniyya and the priorities of Islam. How can we make sure that we are not deviated from the right priorities to the wrong priorities, so that we can address the right issues and address them firmly. Firmness about applying the masalih of the people is part of a Dawla Madaniyya wa Marja'iyya Islamiyya. You cannot have an Islamic reference if you're not firm enough in the application of the Sharia. At that time, I remember debates in the Arab world about people who were involved in murder of the masses in police stations or in other places. And some brothers, because of their Madani approach, they said that they don't want blood on their hand. They don't want to kill anybody, even murderers. And at that time, of course, that was wrong, because if you are a true Madani state, you should have the firmness to punish the criminals. If someone is a murderer and there is no doubt about that, the punishment in the Sharia is capital punishment. If someone is a thief and there is no doubt about that, the punishment in the Sharia is the punishment for theft. And if someone is corrupt, the punishment in the Sharia has to be harsh and has to be firm. To take a Madani approach does not mean to be soft with criminals. To take a Madani approach means to be firm. And that does not contradict with the rahmah of Islam. You heard that again in the Arab world. People were saying that we should show people that the Islamic governance is about rahmah. Yes, but part of the rahmah is the qisas. وَلَكُمْ فِي الْقِصَاصِ حَيَاةٌ يَا أُولِي الْأَلْبَابِ. Part of the rahmah is the application of what you can apply and the firmness in that application, because that is the Islamic reference. The Islamic reference does not mean that we give up on the Islamic principles. At that time, with the Islamic reference and the Madani reference, people were talking about making peace at that time with Israel and so forth. At that time, of course not. The Islamic reference does not mean that you make peace with enemies of Muslims and people who are occupiers of Muslim land. And this is not from rahmah, this is from hawan, from surrendering. وَلَا تَهِنُوا وَتَدْعُوا إِلَى السَّلْمِ وَأَنْتُمُ الْأَعْلَوْنَ وَاللَّهُ مَعَكُمْ وَلَنْ يَتِرَكُمْ أَعْمَالَكُمْ. Allah said in the Quran, do not humiliate yourself and call for peace while there is no peace. There's no peace from the other side. If there is peace from the other side, yeah, then وَإِنْ جَنَحُوا لِلسَّلْمِ فَاجْنَحْ لَهَا. If the enemy calls for peace, then take the direction of peace. But if the enemy calls for war, we are not supposed to be calling for peace. This is not part of the Madani approach. The Madani approach also defends the land, and not just the national land, defend the Muslim land. And this is the nature of the state. And why would a state with a non-Muslim minority defend lands far away? Because this is the character of the state, the identity of the state. And as I mentioned, every constitution has its biases. We cannot say that we're going to have a neutral state towards Muslims. No, we have to have a bias towards our ummah as Muslims. And the Madani approach does not mean to be soft with crime, does not mean to make peace with enemies, does not mean to allow corruption in the name of rahmah or any of that. And it means that you take the right priorities and apply them with firmness. But it does not mean to go and apply the hudud in a way that defeats the maqsid of the hudud. Why did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ask us to apply the hudud? In order to clean the society and clear the society. But the society is corrupt. People have major problems. Before we apply the punishment of theft on them, we have to solve the problems. Otherwise, we are unfair. We are applying the hudud wrongly. And that's why the Sahaba did not apply the hudud all the time. And that is why, people in the Arab world, I haven't seen some of our scholars, I haven't seen any scholar really calling for the application of the hudud in the Arab world. Why? Because we know that the situation needs a lot of rectification, a lot of reform before we think about the idea of the hudud. It is a long story, and I just wanted to give some highlights on the translation as civil. It's not exactly as in civility, as in the political science term of civility, because that they mean something very different. The civil state that they talked about, Hobbes, and the civil state of roles, and the civil state, that when they talk about that, they mean something different. They mean a reference not to Islam. They mean a secular reference. And we're not talking about that. So yes, it is a civil state, but it's not the al-hala al-madaniya or the civil state of Hobbes or Rawls. We don't mean that when we say a dawla al-madaniya or al-hala al-madaniya, but we mean the application of Islam in the contemporary sense. We mean the tajdeed and the renewal and the fiqh of siyasa, the fiqh of politics that is compatible with our time, that understands the problems on the international level and the challenges, the fiqh that understands that Muslim societies that are trying to stand for Islam, like Malaysia, are in danger because this kind of voice is not wanted anywhere in the international politics of today. And therefore, we have to be very aware that we are facing challenges and we approach that in a fiqhi way that is balanced, that is wasati, that is trying to understand, that stands on the firm ground of the Sharia, but tries to see the maqasid, the higher purposes of the Sharia apply first before we talk about anything superficial or anything in the slogan sense, because this is the reality of the Sharia. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala all the best for this project and for people who are working on it to be guided, inshallah, with the fiqh, the right fiqh and the right approach. جزاكم الله خيرا بارك الله فيكم السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.
Alhamdulillah, it's really, I must say, that inspiring, and also it explains a lot of things that happens in Malaysia that actually there were questions arise to it. For example, why this and why that, okay, and why not hudud, okay. So these are the questions from the public as well. So really, Jazakallah khair, Prof. Yasir, your talk really explained the questions coming from the public as well, also from the universities with regards to the political situation and the vision of our leadership in Malaysia. So sekarang adalah sesi soal jawab. So mungkin kita boleh dapatkan satu soalan dahulu. Okey, Datuk Mizan, silakan.
Terima kasih, Prof. Roslina. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. I'm Mizan Hitam from UITM, at the same time Ahli Majlis Agama Islam Melaka. Since the session is in English and my area is town planning, and during the first few minutes of your session, Professor Jasir Auda, I read some of your books regarding city planning, basic. There are many things in my mind, but I don't take this session to ask everything. But we talk about Inna Allah ya'muru bil adli wal ihsan. How are we going to translate this in reality in this Dawlah al-Madaniyah in reality? Conceptual, we are okay with all the concept. The translation of reality. For example, all over the world, we talk from the first nation to the newly industrializing country. The question of the gap between the rich and the poor is everywhere. Fi kulli zaman wa fi kulli makan. So any suggestion in this model of Madani society, we start with 1996 Mujtama al-Madani, now Madani Dawlah al-Madaniyah. Can we come up with some basic model based on at least something that can be operated in the real life?
There is a whole fiqh for that, CD, and we can talk about it on the side or exchange messages, inshallah. City planning has to the Islamic structure of neighbors. There is a whole chapter of fiqh that's called fiqh al-amara, or the fiqh of they talk about huquq al-jar, for example, the neighbors. They're talking about how to form districts out of families so that the families would take care of each other, and how to avoid the cutting of the members of the society into these small cantons and small apartments and all of that French kind of modernism, and how the Islamic approach, yes, in a modern city, is different from the French modernism. So I just advise that you look at fiqh al-amara or the fiqh of architecture. There is a lot of that. It's not popular on social media, but there are lots of books on that. In terms of rich and poor, well, Islam has a number of don't say that everybody has to be equal. We have rich and poor, but poor cannot be hungry and cannot be shelterless, and rich cannot be monopolists and the poor becomes hungry. Government is going to solve the poverty problem. The other Islamic institution that is very important for resolving the poverty problem is the institution of awqaf. And the awqaf are the in the Islamic civilization. In the lecture. That is a basic need from the Islamic perspective. This has to be a right. So it's because of the monopoly of the rich, not because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not give us enough rizq. In every land, there is enough rizq. Allah gave people rizq. But it is the greed of the rich that makes the poor poor. And especially if the poor do not have the basic needs. That is the Islamic
Prof. Yasir Auda adalah jawapannya. So soalan yang kedua daripada puan di depan ini. Sila perkenalkan diri.
But the beautiful of Islam, to strengthen the family, the community, the country, is to strengthen the leaders at each level. For example, in the family, how husband, right, act as a leader to the family, to the wife, to the well-being of the children. Last time we here mostly are senior citizen. When our kids, our boys play football, 7 o'clock, you don't come back, we go and chase, right? But now I think it's very hard to do. But they also play football in the phone, okay? We don't have to chase, right? And for example, amal ma'ruf nahi munkar. We are sometimes here, most of us, or maybe half of us are what is the sunnah, and please remember, we will be asked for 5 things before another 5 things happen. Our free time before we get busy, right? Our health before we fall sick, and so on. So I think the Madani things, we want to reach that kemampanan, kesejahteraan, daya cipta, hormat, yakin, and ihsan begin at home. What do you say, Prof? Thank you.
Jazakumullah khair. I totally agree. I totally agree. I was talking about state at the constitutional level and so on. So I mentioned the issues of criminal law and other issues. But what you mentioned, my sister, is and akhlaq in the society. I understand in the afternoon you have a session where you will discuss family. Is integral. So I agree with you. In terms of the education on the hudud, I think it's necessary that we revise how we do Islamic education. The way we do Islamic education is not compatible with the current fiqh of Islam. We have developed a lot of fiqh. So for example, Al-Hudud al-Shar'iyya, there is a book by Abdul Qadir Ouda, who happened to be my uncle, but it's not because of that, on Al-Tashri' al-Jina'i. And there is a sharh of that book by Dr. Tawfiq al-Shawi and other. It's called the Encyclopedia of Tashri' al-Jina'i. Why don't we teach the hudud and the Tashri' al-Jina'i from the modern books? Why do we teach them from books that talk about different states and so on? And therefore, the kids who learn about the Sharia and they grow to become mullahs and sheikhs and muftis and so on, like the young lads, they don't have the fiqh of the hudud because they didn't teach it and they didn't learn it from the modern books. In another lecture a few months ago, I mentioned, why don't you study fiqh from fiqh al-Qaradawi? Well, why not? Qaradawi is a great faqih and he left a legacy of fiqh. Why do we continue to study fiqh from the past? As a kid, I studied fiqh al-Shafi'iyya, by the way, Minhaj al-Talibin, and so forth. But I don't think that Minhaj al-Talibin is good for the contemporary student of fiqh. Is everywhere about the hudud is because of Islamic and the reform that it needs. And of course, the question about the family, inshallah, it is a very important dimension. Jazakumullah khair.
Okey, soalan adalah tentang struktur keluarga dan pandangan terbaru serta penyelesaian terbaru Dan jawapan Prof. Yasir adalah fiqh terbaru dan juga fiqh selama ini tidak betul-betul selari dengan masalah kekeluargaan di hari ini. So insyaAllah akan ada penyelesaian dan akan ada diskusi lebih lanjut tentang ini kemudian. Ya, soalan yang terakhir dan ketiga, sila perkenalkan diri. Ya.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Oh, sebenarnya yang di belakang, maaf ya.
Okay, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh and very good morning, Prof. So my name is Muhammad Anwar. I'm from UiTM. So my question is about, we are talking about Maqasid. Now we should able to practice, put it in practice, right? So Sharia in practice. So my question, we realize majority is Muslim. What is the main crucial problem we should concentrate here is what is the problem with Malaysian, it could be in any federal, state, local government, there's a corrupted person, or it could be individual involved in corruption. And then we declare we as a Muslim country. If you compare to Singapore, from empirical and scientific finding, I observe, it could be from my analysis, which is Singapore, even though they are not Muslim country, they are more, it could be, they are serious, it could be consistently overcome corruption, this and that. And we are talking about CPI, corruption index. If you compare to Muslim versus, it could be those middle, it could be Europe countries or Singaporean. So I have my personal experience working in previously 9.
Can we please be brief?
Yeah. So the question is two questions. First is why in Malaysia we fail to handle corruption, even though we declare we as a Muslim country. Second, now as you said, in Malaysia we still facing with it could be a secular state or Islamic state. Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim is doing his best, struggling to influence, penetrate, and in terms of grooming the majority Muslim. Because in Malaysia, majority Muslim, their intention to make sure that Malaysia should become as an Islamic state. But then people try to condemn and criticize the Prime Minister, which is they try to relate Anwar with secular mindset worldview. So how?
Thank you very much.
Please, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very
And we must understand that Prof. Yasir Auda can be selective in his answers.
Well, yeah, I am not an expert on the issues. You mentioned why corruption in Europe is less than corruption in Malaysia. I don't think corruption in Europe is less. I live in the West. No, the West is very corrupt, my dear. And that is why you have the policies you have today with Zionism. This is because of corruption. But it's just like sometimes when we are Muslims in Muslim lands, sometimes we don't understand how other societies could be corrupt because of the strength of their media. So no, you cannot really say, if you want to compare, that corruption in Europe is not really high, and you can see it very much. Now, the Islamic versus secular, you see, this dichotomy itself is not correct. Of course, Malaysia is an Islamic state, but of course, Malaysia is a secular state too, because it is both. And I think the Madani idea is a great step forward so that we go beyond that debate between the Islamic and secular, not just in Malaysia, in the Arab world too. This book of mine that I showed you is not written for Malaysia, it's written for the Arab world. It's a problem everywhere where there are Muslims and calling for an Islamic state, but they don't know what an Islamic state is, and they're asking for a fiqh of hudud that is not comprehensive, and they don't understand. And when they call for a secular state, they also lose the Islamic ground. So I believe that this idea of a Madani state is good, not just for Malaysia, it's good for the Arab world, good for every Muslim majority country. And I think it's a step forward.
I saw actually two people were Sister, so please be brief. Maybe one sentence for introduction, one sentence for your question. Thank you.
Assalamualaikum. You talk about nation building and Westphalian system. I would like you is such a mono-ethnic kind of way of administration, such as, for example, a country who still practices is South Korean in Japan. So I would like your opinion on the issue and how does the Arab world need to view or need to improvise their spirit of nationalism. Thank you. Assalamualaikum.
MashaAllah, that's a big question, my sister. It's not, it has roots, of course, in the Quran. وكيف يحكمونك if you are into philosophy of law, but it is actually a good idea, and the Ottomans did well with that, in my perspective, in terms of the millet system. But you cannot really parallelize crime. Crime has to be one crime for the whole society. Otherwise, you create corruption in the society if people jump to a different religion so that they are not criminal when they do a crime. So that's all. That's a brief answer, inshallah.
Okay, I saw someone, yes. That would be the last one, inshallah.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. I'm Zamzuri. I'm jobless now, Prof.
SubhanAllah.
But very interesting what you have presented to us just now. I have a very short questions. You mentioned about the concept of Madani during the traditional scholars is quite different. We cannot implement 100% this time because the framework itself is very different. So my question is, how do the Malaysia, you see in Malaysia, we have a very different set of Western based on the constitution. Yes. How do we assimilate or adapt the concept of Daulah Madinah to Malaysian framework? You can make
well, that, yeah.
Is it to integrate?
Yeah, how?
To integrate the Daulah Medina.
Yes, yes.
Medina.
To the Malaysia, because the Malaysian different, the Malaysian is when the Malaysian established is not according to the framework during the traditional scholars. So how much, right? For instance, Maqasid Syariah that you mentioned just now, Malaysian can adapt to that or at this time, and how much we can improve to achieve 100% or at least 90% Maqasid Syariah has been mentioned by you just now.
Barakallahu feekum. Well, this is what my lecture was about, really. I tried to answer this question in the lecture. How can we adopt by looking at the latest in fiqh siyasa shar'iyya? Siyasa shar'iyya has developed from the time of the old schools, and there are scholars of today who talked about a Dawla Madaniyya in the fiqhi sense, and how to put Maqasid Sharia in the center of that, and center of the objectives and the priorities for the state. So this is how you can do that. Now, how to translate that into policies will require a policy committee that works on how to translate the good ideas into policies in the state itself, because the state will need certain decisions and priorities, and will have to make some choices and so forth. that would require people who are expert in policy making to take these values and principles and translate them into laws and regulations, etc. Allah Alam, that's Barakallah fiik.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Jazakumullah khair for the questions, and also thank you, Prof. Yasir, for the really answers. I mean that we couldn't find anywhere. Okay, Alhamdulillah. So I guess that's all. So I will pass to the MC.
Terima kasih yang diucapkan kepada moderator yang berbahagia Prof. Datin Dr. Roslina Othman dan yang berbahagia Profesor Dr. Jasir Auda di atas Ucaptama hari kedua yang berjudul Maqasid Framework in Dato' Ahmad Azam Abdul Rahman, Presiden Wadah Pencerdasan Umat Malaysia untuk menyampaikan cenderamata kepada yang berbahagia Profesor Dr. Jasir Auda dan kepada moderator yang berbahagia Prof. Datin Dr. Roslina Othman. Dipersilakan. Terima kasih diucapkan kepada Dato' Ahmad Azam Abdul Rahman, Presiden Wadah Kerjasama Umat Malaysia kerana menyampaikan cenderamata kepada penyampai Ucaptama hari kedua dan moderator untuk sesi pagi ini. Majlis akan berehat seketika, diminta kepada semua VIP, moderator, pembentang dan semua peserta untuk minum pagi yang telah disediakan dan mohon untuk masuk ke Dewan lebih awal kerana kita akan bermula jam 10.45 pagi ini insya-Allah.